Hello, everybody. My name is Khalil Iqshir. I am the Assistive Technology Specialist at UNC Charlotte. And with me today is Katie Monti, and she will be introducing herself when time comes. We would like to welcome you to our Universal Design Fast Facts series. This series started as a result of another workshop that was about 6 hours, but commitment to 6 hours was kind of difficult for end users, for participants. That's why we broke down this series to 12 sessions, and today we'll be having the first session of the series, and we'll be covering legal requirement and definitions.
All right.
Can you click next? So our objective in this session, by the end of this workshop, you'll be able to recognize UNC Charlotte as a state university and recognize its legal obligations. You'll be able also to name a few of the legal requirements that protect people with disabilities and promotes equal access. You'll be able to differentiate between two important terminologies, accommodation versus accessibility. People normally can confuse, is that an accommodation or an accessibility, and who's responsible for this or that? You will be able also to provide examples of physical and electronic accessibility, and you will be able to recognize universal design as an approach to inclusiveness. Next. Now I'll leave it for Katie. Katie.
Okay, thank you, Halil. So hi, everyone. My name is Katie Monti. I'm the ADA Project Coordinator here at UNC Charlotte. And my role today is to talk to you about the reasons why accessibility is important. I'm going to give you a broad overview about people with disabilities and why accessibility is important so that you can better understand the intent behind this series that focuses specifically on electronic accessibility. So I'm going to start out with the legal requirements, and I'm not going to get into a lot of detail with this, except to say that there are federal and state laws that protect people with disabilities against discrimination. There's Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is a primary focus on education. And there's Section 508, which came about much later in 1998. Which speaks specifically to accessibility of electronic content of the internet, websites, and content that is made electronic and is specific to accessibility for those types of services and information. The ADA, you're probably familiar with, which came about in 1990, and it's a bit of a broader, sweeping federal civil rights law to protect people against disabilities. It applies to just about every public setting that we have, not just education or not just entities that receive federal funding, like the Rehabilitation Act is. Then there was the ADA Amendments Act of 2008, which essentially resulted in a broader definition of what it means to be disabled. And I'll discuss in just a minute about the definitions of disability. Okay, so I just mentioned the Section 508 and how it applied to electronic accessibility. And one of the ways that, that the awareness of the need for electronic accessibility came about was through some lawsuits that did occur in some post-secondary institutions. One of them was Arizona State University. And in 2009, a lawsuit was brought about by the National Federation for the Blind against the institution. And essentially, the text of it is that Arizona State University required the use of a Kindle ebook reader as like a course requirement for all students. But there were components of the Kindle ebook that were not accessible for screen readers, which is a software that is used by people who are blind to have text from a computer read aloud to them. So parts of the Kindle, like the main menu to use the things in the Kindle, the e-store, other parts of it were not fully accessible for a screen reader. As a result of that, the students who were blind that relied on screen reader technology had to have a human assistant to use their Kindle, to submit their work, to read their articles, to do all the things that all the students were required to do. But the issue with that, of course, is that they were not able to do these things independently. They could not do the work in the middle of the night, at the very last minute, like students often do. They had to have a set schedule with their assistant to make sure that they had the help they needed to submit their work and to do their work. And essentially, the National Federation for the Blind said, you know, this is not equal access. These students are paying the same amount of tuition as all the other students in the class, but they do not have equal, same access to their course content as the other students do. And the court agreed with them. So this resulted, this was one of several lawsuits that came about that brought an increased awareness around the need to make sure electronic content is accessible for everyone. All right, so I referenced that about the broadening of the definition of disability. There is a definition, and I won't go into a lot of the detail with this, except to say that a person who has a disability is someone who essentially has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of their major life activities. Major life activities can change in a person's life, right, from one part of their life to another. College students, a major life activity for them is learning. But a major life activity for a 55-year-old CEO of a company is going to be very different, and their disability might impact them differently at different life stages. But there is this definition, and when we talk about disability, it's important to know that of all the people with disabilities, over 96% have a disability that is completely hidden. So you wouldn't know that they had a disability just by looking at them. The majority of people that have a visible disability, which might include people who use a wheelchair, or someone who is blind, or someone who has a service animal, someone who has a sign language interpreter because they're deaf. That percentage of people with visible disabilities is very small. So you could very easily and are likely interacting with someone with a disability multiple times a day, just about every day. Okay. Now I'm going to break down the differences between accommodation and accessibility. Accommodation is something that's provided to a person who has demonstrated and meets the definition of being disabled. So an accommodation is very individualized. It is something given to a person with a disability to make sure to help them have access to whatever the service or the program is. So for our students, an accommodation is something that gives them equal access to their courses, to their academic setting. For an employee, an accommodation would be something that allowed them as an individual to successfully do their job. So when you think about accommodation, think of it as very customized, very individualized, and is only provided on our campus from two different entities. For students, accommodations are solely determined through the Office of Disability Services, by the professionals in that office that evaluate medical documentation. They determine if the person has a disability, and then if they do, if they meet that definition, then they meet with them individually, and they determine very individualized accommodations. If it is an employee, then human resources personnel perform those same tasks. But this is important to remember so that you know that as a faculty or staff member, it's not up to you to determine if a person in fact is disabled, and if they are, what accommodations are appropriate for them. Accommodations simply level the playing field in post-secondary education and in employment. And so it's important to allow the people trained in that field to determine which accommodations are reasonable and appropriate. So here's some examples of accommodations that you might see, or to give you an example, to give you an idea of what an accommodation is. Priority seating, assistive technology, assistive software or hardware, and you'll see up in the left-hand corner here something called a smart nav, which is essentially like a computer chip in a way that is worn on a person's forehead or on their glasses, or it can be put on a hat. And it allows that person to navigate a computer independently if they are unable to move their arms. So people who have quadriplegia oftentimes might use a smart nav, and it's something that allows them to be independent. So that's a good example of an accommodation that's very specific and individualized to that person. Other examples might be class notes, extra time for exams with our students, and text conversion. So in the left-hand bottom corner, you see an example of Braille. Braille would certainly be an accommodation for one person who happens to use Braille, who needs Braille to access their content. We also have here an example of what's called a CCTV, and this is a device that significantly magnifies print on paper, like a book or a test, for someone who has low vision and needs extremely magnified text in order to read it. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears now and talk about accessibility. And how is accessibility different? Accessibility is actually everyone's responsibility. It is not just for the professionals who work with the disability community. Accessibility is the practice of designing and developing in the electronic world websites and applications so that their presentation, content, functionalities are as understandable and operable by as many people as possible. So it's designed certainly to ensure access for people with disabilities, but it might also work well for lots of different types of users. I like to think of accessibility as the proactive form of serving people with disabilities. It's things that are in place ahead of time for lots of people, rather than something that is specific to an individual. And it's also something that's not put in place after somebody asks for it. It's in place already. So a good example of that would be a ramp to get into a building. When you're talking about physical accessibility, as an analogy, a ramp's a great example. It ensures that someone who must use a ramp, who cannot use stairs, excuse me, it ensures that someone who cannot use stairs has a means to get into a building, right? But it also serves as a way, a point of entry or a form of access for someone that has a rolling cart with them, or someone who has a baby stroller. So it certainly serves people with disabilities, but it's a form of accessibility that is in place and is there for lots of different users. Okay. Here's some examples of accessibility. I like using this photo because the width of a doorway in order to get into a room is a great form of accessibility. That's something that is certainly put into place ahead of time. And when we're talking about electronic accessibility, I like this analogy. I think it's helpful to have this visual. So when you're looking at making sure your electronic content is accessible, think of it like this. It needs to be in place ahead of time. If you had your course or your website or whatever information you were sharing, if you were doing it in a physical space and a person was unable to be a part of that because they couldn't get into the room, then you certainly would need to adjust and make changes. And so it's important to keep that in mind when you're looking at electronic accessibility. It's very, very similar. Another example that I show here is the device used to open a door down at the bottom right-hand corner. A round doorknob is not necessarily usable by everybody. It requires tight grasping and twisting with the hand, and not everybody can do that. So the image to the right, the lever, allows someone to open a door with maybe a closed fist or with the side of their hand if they're unable to manipulate the item with their fingers. But a lever A lever door opener is also something that's very helpful for people, for lots of different users. It can be helpful when you have your hands full and you need to use your elbow to open the door, for example. So it's more universally designed, it's accessible, and it works for lots of different users. And use of a microphone not only helps people that are hard of hearing, but might help everyone in the room successfully be able to hear what's being said or to capture that information that's being presented. And certainly video captions are also the same. So I'm going to talk just a little more about captions. This has become more and more of a topic of interest as we have switched to a lot of online learning and virtual education. There's kind of two different branches of video captions. One is captions as an accommodation, and that's back to, as we talked about, an individualized accommodation for a student that's already been determined and is legally required. That's managed through disability services. So if a student has captions as an accommodation, then not only is it a legal requirement, but our office has some assistance that we can provide to make sure that your course content is captioned. And if you have a student that needs this, you get several emails from our department to help make sure that if you have media in your course, that it is captioned and captioned in advance of when it's being shown in the classroom. So again, once captions are an accommodation, it is a legal requirement. But there's also a branch of video captions that is a form of accessibility. And this is also very, very important and I believe will be legally required in the future to be done in advance, similar to, ramps being put in place on buildings are now legally required. And captions as a form of accessibility, so when you have not had a very specific student accommodation request for captions, but you still want to make sure that your content is accessible, that can be done with the assistance of the Center for Teaching and Learning and through your captions, through your Canvas course, through the media interface with Kaltura. The good news is that, this technology is getting easier while making sure captions are accurate and are provided can sometimes be a tedious task. The technology is allowing it to be much easier and move more quickly. So that's important to keep in mind. But with captions in general, it can get complicated. And so if you ever have questions or concerns about whether you need to provide captions or how to provide captions, you can always reach out to myself or to our office directly, and we're happy to assist with that. So when we talk about captions, oftentimes what will come up is auto captions or mechanical captions. Some people are now calling it AI captions, like artificial intelligence captions. We're seeing a lot more of that. And again, in general, auto captions are not considered to be ADA compliant because they are not necessarily considered to be accurate enough to provide accurate information to people who are deaf or hard of hearing. However, auto captions are steadily improving. YouTube's auto captions used to be awful. They're now better. And they are getting better as well with online learning platforms or meeting platforms. Currently for our university, WebEx does not have auto captions as an option. Google Meet has auto captions that are quite accurate, although I know we are, as a university, moving away from Google Meet as a platform for courses. Zoom is working on providing auto captions similar to Google Meet, like you can turn them on. But they have not started those yet. And so we don't really know the accuracy of the Zoom auto captions. But I will say this, and again, you can just contact our office if you have questions about this, but if you receive an accommodation request for captions, they must be done professionally. They can be, you can take auto captions and you can edit them to make them correct. And if you are adding captions as a form of accessibility, we still encourage you to look at your auto captions and edit the transcript if necessary, and make sure that the things are spelled correctly, that there's punctuation, that they can be understood by everyone. Okay, so now I'd like you to just take a look at this picture here, because I think that this is a good example of universal design. I've been talking about accommodation, I've talked about accessibility, and sort of they kind of all come around to this overall concept of universal design that I think is important to understand. To the right on this picture is what's called a lift, or a platform lift, and to the left are stairs. So you can look at this platform lift and see that technically it's accessible, because a person who cannot use steps can use the lift to get up to, if you can see in the background, there's pictures of elevators. So you could definitely say that this entrance, this route to get to those elevators is accessible. It has the lift, or you can use the stairs. Okay, but to operate a lift can be very complicated. The instructions on how to use it vary for each one. There's certainly more time involved to get into the lift, to maneuver it, to get to the top, to get out, and that is definitely harder and slower than someone who's going to use the steps to get to the elevator. So a solution to this would be something like a ramp. As I keep mentioning as an example, a ramp is a great form of universal design. A ramp is as easy to use as stairs, and arguably takes about the same amount of time, and can be used by other people as well, that even people that do not have a disability. And so I would say this is not a universally designed entrance to or route to the elevators. I think a ramp would be better. So as we talk about the definition of universal design, I think that this quote was helpful to me. You know, when you're looking at accessibility, there are technical standards. They provide specifications and requirements to remove barriers, whether it's electronic or physical barriers for people with disabilities. But universal design provides a design framework for combining principles and requirements into building a barrier-free and equitable world, which can be often, that equitable world can look very different and can be much more inclusive than just a barrier-free world. And then I'm going to leave you with a quote from the definition, excuse me, of universal design that was created by Ron Mace, who founded the Center for Universal Design at NC State. And it's essentially the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. That is our presentation for today. Again, this was a broad overview. We go into a little more detail in our 6-hour certificate program. But if you ever have any questions or about the content that we've discussed today, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself, to Katie Monty, or to Halil at Share. And we also have our websites here, and you're welcome to use those as well. Thank you very much for attending today.
Thank you. Good job.
Okay.